Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Luna told Finn 5 words before dying during the revocation, and those 5 words, spoken in a breath formerly lacing, carried on a voice that quivered not with fear but with an unsupportable tender-heartedness, came the axis around which Finn's entire world violently, irrevocably turned. Because in that sterile room where the lights were too bright and the walls too clean and the air hummed with the indifferent ministry of procedure and protocol, Luna's life condensed into a final, fragile moment that refused to be contained by medical language or moral argument, and Finn, who had believed he was prepared, who had told himself that love meant being strong and probative and rational, discovered instead that love meant collapsing, shattering, being hugely undone as Luna looked at him with eyes that held reason, remission, memory, and commodity close to peace, and said, "Please don't forget me." 5 words that exploded inside him like a slow, endless explosion. Because forgetting was the one thing Finn knew he could no way do, and yet the plea inferred the terror that she herself felt, the terror of evaporating, of getting a citation in someone differently's survival story, and Finn burst into gashes not with the dramatic blubbing he'd always imagined grief would bring, but with a raw, beast sound that escaped him before he could stop it, a sound that sounded to come from nearly aged than language, nearly beneath his caricatures, and as Luna's hand slipped from his, as the warmth began its quiet retreat, Finn collapsed emotionally in a way that was immediate but cascading, like a structure whose supports fail one by one, because first he lost her voice, also her warmth, also the future he'd unconsciously erected around her actuality, and also eventually the interpretation of himself who had believed that love could be navigated without loss, and those 5 words, so simple, so ruinous, replayed in his mind again and again, each reiteration shelling back another subcast of meaning, because please carried her modesty and her fear, doent carried the hopeless resistance to erasure, forget carried the weight of oblivion she couldn't fight, me carried her entire tone reduced to a single syllable, and together they formed a judgment that was less a request than a heritage, a command written not an essay but an absence, and Finn, left standing while the world continued its indifferent gyration, set up that time didn't slow or stop to recognize Luna's final moments, it simply moved on, cruelly effective, leaving him to reuse the enormity of what had just happened while nursers spoke vocally and maps were streamlined and doors opened and closed as if nothing extraordinary had passed, and yet for Finn everything had passed, everything had ended and begun contemporaneously, because Luna's ruinous farewell didn't simply mark her death, it marked the death of certainty. The death of the vision that love could be fairly distributed into right opinions and wrong opinions, and Finn's gashes were end only for Luna but for the complexity of the choice they had faced, a choice that had been bandied in quiet late-night exchanges filled with sense and care and collective concern, a choice made with compassion and fear and stopgap intertwined, and now, in the fate, Finn realized that no quantum of logic could shield him from the grief that followed, because grief didn't watch about defense, it only watched about attachment, and Finn had been profoundly, irrevocably attached to Luna, to her laugh that always came half a second too late, to the way she said his name as if it were commodity precious, to the small rituals they had erected together without realizing they were erecting a life, and as he collapsed into a president, body shaking, heart pounding as though it might tear itself piecemeal trying to escape the pain. He understood that those 5 words had changed everything because they reframed his memory of her entire actuality, transubstantiating every once moment into commodity fragile and finite, commodity formerly slipping down, and yet also commodity sacred, because to flash back Luna now wasn't just to recall her presence but to recognize her final request, to laboriously repel the erasure she stressed, and Finn's gashes soaked into his hands, into his sleeves, into the veritably fabric of the day, marking him in a way that couldn't be washed out, because emotional collapse isn't dramatic in the way stories frequently portray it, it's disorienting, exhausting, demeaning in its intensity, and Finn set up himself heaving, his casket tight, his studies disintegrated, as if his mind were a room filled with fractured glass, each shard reflecting a different interpretation of what might have been, and in those reflections he saw Luna smiling, Luna crying, Luna making jokes to hide her fear, Luna brooding those 5 words, and the reiteration came both torture and anchor, because while it hurt to hear them, it hurt more to imagine a future in which they faded, and so Finn cleaved to them, let them sculpt themselves into his memory so deeply that forgetting would be insolvable, indeed if he wanted to, and in the days and weeks that followed, Finn's emotional collapse didn't resolve itself neatly. It dallied, it reshaped him, because grief isn't a singular event but a process, and every time he encountered commodity that reminded him of Luna, a song, a scent, a fleeting comment, those 5 words rose again, not always with the same sharpness but with a patient pang, and Finn began to understand that Luna's final moments weren't only about death but about connection, about the hopeless mortal need to be seen and flashed back, and that consummation both assured and visited him, because it placed a responsibility on his shoulders that he could no way set down, and yet he accepted it, because love had always been commodity he chose, and flashing back Luna came the last, most continuing choice he could make for her. And so the script of Luna told Finn 5 words before dying during revocation isn't simply a story of tragedy but a contemplation on how a many syllables can carry the weight of a continuance, how a farewell can come a morning of a different kind of actuality, one lived in memory and influence, rather than physical presence. And Finn's gashes, his collapse, his slow reconstruction of tone are all part of the fate of those 5 words that changed everything, because they stripped life down to its most essential verity that we're defined not only by how we live but by how we're flashed back, and in that sense, Luna didn't vanish when her heart stopped, because she continued to live in Finn's grief, in his devotion to memory, in the quiet moments when he rumored back to her. Absence, I wa'n't, a pledge forged in gashes, sustained by love, and made unbreakable by loss. Finn didn't crop from that pledge total, he surfaced altered, reshaped by a grief that didn't advertise itself politely or follow any direct path, but rather arrived in swells that knocked him down when he least anticipated it, because the days after Luna's death blurred together in a haze of executive musts and social rituals that felt stag in their normality, as if the world had conspired to continue performing purely out of malignancy, and Finn set up himself subscribing forms, answering questions, seesawing when spoken to, all while feeling as though he were watching someone additional inhabit his body, someone moving through movements he no longer understood, because the interpretation of him who had participated jokes with Luna, who had planned refections and weekends and imaginary futures, had been still gutted along with her final breath, leaving behind a hollowed-out space where certainty used to live, and in that emptiness the 5 words echoed endlessly, occasionally as a tale, occasionally as a laugh, occasionally as a dull, metrical palpitation that synced with his twinkle, reminding him that remembering was now both his duty and his curse. At night, Finn lay awake replaying Luna's final moments not because he wanted to suffer, but because his mind refused to let go, as if reiteration might ever unleash an alternate ending, and he scanned every detail with cruel perfection, the way her fritters quivered slightly as she reached for his hand, the way her lips plotted to shape the words, the transitory wimpiness in her eyes when he squeezed back as if to say he was there, he was staying, he'd carry whatever she could not, and in those insomniac hours he began to understand that memory isn't an unresistant act but an active, exhausting labor, because each recollection needed him to renew injuries that had slightly begun to scab, and yet he stressed that rest, real rest, muscle dull the sharpness of those recollections, might let them slip just enough to betray her final request, and so prostration came a form of devotion, a way to prove, to himself further than anyone differently, that he was still hearkening. The world, meanwhile, offered condolences that landed awkwardly, expressions like time heals and she wouldn't want you to be sad floating toward him like well-meaning debris, and Finn smiled weakly, thanked people, and swallowed the appetite to scream that time didn't heal, it simply concentrated new jests over old injuries, and that Luna, who had known him better than anyone, would no way have demanded happiness as penance for her death. She'd have understood that sadness was simply love with nowhere to go, and so Finn let himself feel it completely, indeed when it embarrassed him, indeed when it rendered him useless for entire afterlife where he sat on the bottom gaping at nothing, because grief, he learned, didn't watch about productivity or quality, it only watched about honesty. In quiet moments, Finn began to talk to Luna, not out loud at first, but internally, addressing studies to her as if she were simply in another room, and these exchanges weren't lyrical or profound, they were mundane, filled with compliances she'd have appreciated, jokes she'd have rolled her eyes at, frustrations she'd have teased him for taking too seriously, and in this way Luna remained woven into the fabric of his diurnal life, not as a ghost but as a presence shaped by memory and habit, and while some part of Finn knew this was his mind's way of managing, Another part cleaved to the idea that remembrance itself was a form of survival, that as long as he continued to suppose of her, to integrate her into his ongoing narrative, she was entirely gone. There were moments, too, when wrathfulness surfaced suddenly, sharp and disorienting, directed at no bone. And everyone formerly at the unfairness of the situation, at the limitations of choice, at the atrocity of a macrocosm that demanded similar offerings without explanation, and Finn scuffled with guilt over this wrathfulness, stewing it meant he was betraying Luna's memory, but ultimately he realized that wrathfulness was simply another hand of grief, a kick against the permanence of loss, and admitting it didn't dwindle his love, it affirmed how deeply he'd watched, because incuriosity, not wrathfulness, would have been the true treason. As weeks turned into months, Finn noticed subtle changes in himself, not the dramatic mending others sounded to anticipate, but a gradational expansion of emotional range that allowed pain to attend with moments of quiet beauty, like the way the morning light filtered through his window or the way a foreigner's kindness briefly restored his faith in humanity. And these moments no longer felt like intrusions on his grief but like monuments that life, stubborn and unyielding, continued to offer jests indeed in the fate of desolation, and Finn learned to accept them without guilt, understanding that flashing back Luna didn't bear him to indurate himself in suffering. It needed him to carry her forward in the way he lived, in the empathy he extended, in the care he took with fragile effects. The 5 words, once a source of constant agony, began to shift in texture over time, still painful but also grounding, a criterion he returned to when the world felt unrecognizable, and he started to interpret them not only as a plea born of fear but as an expression of trust, because Luna had chosen him as the keeper of her memory, and that trust invested Finn's grief with purpose, transubstantiating it from commodity that simply happened to him into commodity he laboriously shaped, and in this way, flashing back came an act of love rather than an unresistant abidance of pain. Finn ultimately set up himself telling Luna's story to others, not the overemphasized interpretation stripped of nuance, but the honest one, filled with complexity, tender-heartedness, and anguish, and while speaking it audibly was frightening at first, he discovered that participating her story didn't adulterate it, it strengthened it, anchoring her actuality in the participated knowledge of those who heeded. And every time someone flashed back her name, every time her story urged empathy rather than judgment, Finn felt as though he'd recognized her final request in a palpable way, expanding the circle of remembrance beyond his own fragile heart. There were still days when grief ambuscaded him without warning, when a sound or expression or a passing resemblance touched off a fresh surge of loss, and on those days Finn allowed himself to collapse again, to cry, to mourn without reason. Because he'd learned that mending didn't mean the absence of pain, it meant the capability to carry pain without being destroyed by it, and each time he survived another surge, he felt a quiet adaptability taking root, not erasing his love for Luna, but buttressing it, like scar towel forming over a crack that would no way completely vanish but no longer bled uncontrollably. In time, Finn came to understand that Luna's final moments weren't defined solely by death but by connection, by the fierce asseveration that love be flashed back indeed in the face of erasure, and this understanding reshaped his view of life itself, making him more attentive, more present, more willing to admit the fragility of mortal bonds without retreating from them, because if loss was ineluctable, also love, still temporary, was still worth the threat, still worth the pain that followed, and in this consummation Finn set up a quiet, hard-won peace. He no way forgot Luna, not in the simplistic sense of constant mourning, but in the deeper sense of integration, of allowing her influence to percolate his choices and values. And whenever the 5 words resurfaced, as they inescapably did, Finn responded not with despair but with resoluteness, quietly reaffirming the pledge he'd made in the moment of her end, a pledge forged in grief but sustained by time, and though the pain of her absence no way completely faded, it converted into commodity softer, commodity that accompanied with gratefulness, because to have loved Luna, to have been loved by her, was a gift Finn would carry for the rest of his life, and flashing back her was no longer just an obligation born of tragedy, it was an ongoing act of devotion, a living testament to the verity that indeed in consummations, meaning endures. As the seasons shifted nearly gradually around him, Finn began to notice how grief altered his sense of time, stretching some moments until they felt unsupportable while compressing entire weeks into commodity that sounded to pass without him ever truly inhabiting it, And this deformation came one of the most unsettling aspects of life after Luna, because it corroborated the feeling that he was no longer accompanied with the world, that he was living on a resemblant track where everything moved according to a different sense, one governed not by timetables or timepieces but by memory and emotional resonance, and in this altered state he set up himself both further fragile and more perceptive, suitable to notice small details he might formerly have overlooked, the way a person's voice softened when speaking about someone they loved, the subtle vacillation before delicate trueness, the quiet frippery it took simply to keep going after loss. Finn ultimately returned to places he and Luna had participated, not all at formerly, not designedly at first, but gradationally, nearly accidentally, as if his body were guiding him back before his mind had completely agreed, and these returns were fraught with emotion, each position concentrated with echoes of who they had been together, each one hanging to overwhelm him with an unforeseen, visceral sense of absence. And yet he persisted, because avoiding these places felt too important, like erasure, like conceding home to grief rather of integrating it, and so he walked the familiar paths, sat on the benches they had formerly enthralled, ordered the food she had loved, and let the recollections wash over him without trying to control their intensity, trusting that abidance itself was a form of remembrance. There were moments during these solitary pilgrimages when Finn felt close to Luna in a way that startled him, not as a supernatural presence but as an internal alignment, a sense that he was shortly seeing the world through a lens she had helped shape, and in those moments he understood that love does end evaporate when the person does, it migrates, bedding itself in perception, in values, in the way one chooses to respond to pain rather than retreat from it, and this consummation brought with it a quiet comfort, not the relief of check but the steadier consolation of durability, the knowledge that Luna's influence had ended with her life but had simply changed form. Finn also began to fate how his grief bisected with broader questions he'd preliminarily avoided, questions about responsibility, agency, and the limits of choice, and he set up himself allowing deeply about how society simplifies complex jests into taglines and absolutes, frequently stripping them of their mortal texture in the process, and while he didn't seek to turn his pain into a public argument, he felt a growing resoluteness to repel narratives that cancelled nuance, that treated loss as theoretical rather than lived, and in this resoluteness he set up a new kind of purpose, one that didn't replace what he'd lost but gave him a way to recognize it through empathy and honesty. In exchanges with others who had educated loss, different losses, shaped by different circumstances, Finn discovered a participated language that transcended specifics, a collective recognition of the way grief rearranges precedences and exposes vulnerabilities, and these connections, conditional at first, gradationally came sources of support, reminding him that while his pain was uniquely his, the capacity to endure it was commodity deeply mortal, commodity that linked him to others in quiet, implied ways, and through these connections Finn learned that flashing back Luna didn't have to be a solitary act, it could live within a network of participated understanding, each person carrying their own interpretation of remembrance, each one validating the others simply by being present. There were still nights when Finn pictured of Luna, dreams so pictorial they left him disoriented upon waking, his body replying as if she had been physically present, and these dreams were both a gift and a torment, offering transitory reunions that dissolved with the morning light, leaving behind a fresh pang that dallied for hours, and yet he came to cherish them, because they reminded him that his mind still held her with remarkable clarity, that memory, for all its fragility, was able of conjuring commodity nearly palpable, and he began to see these dreams not as cruel tricks but as substantiation of how deeply she remained bedded in him. Over time, Finn noticed that his internal exchanges with Luna changed in tone, shifting from hopeless updates and rumored justifications to commodity more reflective, more balanced, as if he were gradationally accepting that while she couldn't respond, the act of speaking to her still served a purpose, allowing him to articulate studies and feelings he might else suppress, and in this way Luna came not only a memory but a glass, a reference point against which he measured his choices. Asking himself what kind of person he wanted to be in light of the love they had participated. Finn also brazened the fear he'd carried since Luna's final request, the fear that forgetting might be not all at formerly but sluggishly, through waste, through the gradational fading of details no bone could purposely hold on to ever, and this fear visited him until he realized that forgetting, in the absolute sense, wasn't the true peril, Because memory isn't stationary, it evolves, and while certain specifics might blur over time, the substance of who Luna had been to him would persist, shaping him in ways that didn't bear perfect recall, and this consummation eased some of his anxiety, allowing him to release the insolvable burden of conserving every detail and rather concentrate on conserving what signified most: the impact of her presence, the love they had participated, the values that had surfaced from it. As Finn grew more comfortable carrying his grief alongside his life, he set up himself able of imagining a future again, not the bone he'd formerly envisaged with Luna, but a future that conceded her absence without being defined solely by it, and this shift was subtle and unsettling, because it felt at first like a treason, like moving forward meant leaving her before, but gradationally he understood that moving forward wasn't the same as moving on, that growth didn't negate remembrance, and that the pledge he'd made, to no way forget, did not bear him to remain frozen in loss. It needed him to live in a way that recognized the love that had shaped him. There came a moment, quiet and normal by external norms, when